Once we have created our trading partner agreement, we are now in a state to be able to test our whole simulation process. That is the whole translation process wherein we execute the workflows that we have configured and actually get to see whether the translation takes place as desired or not. For testing the simulation, we would invoke the implementer application and use the simulator productivity tool that is available in the product. For this, we'll open an existing map file and say simulate. In our case, it's a nested sequential input file that is to be provided, which is the ABC orders layout. The agreement is the ABC XYZ agreement that we had just configured. And when we specify OK, the complete simulation takes place. So if we go on to understanding the simulation verbose output, this is the input file that we had submitted. This is the agreement that we had created between the partners ABC and XYZ. The first workflow got executed, which mentioned that this particular data file that was provided has to be analyzed against the ABC orders XYZ layout that we had selected in the Analyze E1 M1 work. Following which, the second work, that is the map agreement to envelope message, is executed. So if you see, this is the map file that we had selected, TPI to EDIFACT control lay. So the complete trading partner agreement is loaded, all the information that we had specified while creating the agreement, and each information that we have configured in the trading partner agreement, like the FG receiver ID, the interchange receiver ID, the interchange sender ID, the syntax version, all these information are mapped to the respective control envelope segments so that the envelope segments of the EDI side get generated. Following which, the third workflow, that is the message to message work that we had configured, is executed. For this, we had configured the map file as AB XYZ orders. So the mappings that we had configured in this map file are executed. Last of all, the generation work that we had specified, that is the location was outgoing, and the file naming format that we had specified, ABC XYZ followed by today's date, today's time, and a unique tag. So this is the output file that got generated using the separators that we had specified in the agreement. So if you remember, we had specified the segment terminator as a pipeline, the data element separator as asterisk mark, and the component data element as colon. So using the separator information that we had specified in the agreement level, the output file is generated. The output file, if we had specified a transmit work, would have got moved to the sent folder by default. So we can always trace it out in the sent folder. So this is the folder that has the input file, the output file. So if you see UNA, the XYZ sender and receiver, the asterisk mark, the pipelines, as desired, the output file is generated in this location. We had also specified during our transmit E2M2 work that this particular file should be transmitted to this location. So if you see, this is the output file, a copy of which was archived in the sent item folder. So what we have done is done a simulation of the whole translation process after creating the agreement. Had there been any errors, you would have been able to view them in the errors tab. The file info tab would show me the complete file information detail during the simulation. This whole thing can be now configured on translator to work directly once we start off with configuring the source file identification rule. Source file identification rule is a very important configuration that would actually configure EDISHERE to start translating on a 24/7 mode directly from the translator. So till now what we had done in implementer was we actually manually selected the agreement and provided the input file. However, in source file identification rule, we would configure certain rules to indicate that if translator receives this particular file, then this is the agreement with which it has to be translated. Agreement rules could be based on various factors which can be configured, for which we can go to Tools, System Options, or use this toolbar button and go to the Source File Identification tab. We say Add to add a source file identification rule. The various parameters for the rule could be a file name pattern, input directory name, a source directory name, or a start segment ID, version, or an expression. Let me just start off with an example of the file name pattern. In a file name pattern rule, we would specify that if the particular file name starts with ABC, and let me just give it a rule name ID, I would want this agreement to be picked up for translating this file. After that, I check the rule to make it on, and now if I submit my file, you can see that my file just got translated. So the input file started with ABC, so all files that would start with ABC would get translated according to this agreement. My second option for source file identification rule would be based on the input directory name. So I again check the input directory name and specify my folder wherein I expect all my files to come into the ABC ERP orders folder, and if this particular file comes into this folder, I would want it to be translated as per this agreement. Apply this agreement, this SFIDRule, and submit the file for translation. So now you see it has used the new rule and done the translation. If I uncheck this rule, the translation would fail. For example, when no rules are provided, translator will not be able to identify the corresponding agreement for it, and I would get a source file identification error, check rule. The third option for adding a source file identification rule is a source directory name, wherein when your file is directly received, this would be the input receiver folder. I also have an option of start segment ID, which is typically used in case of EDI files where we know that the first three elements or element ID is the ISA, and in case of it is the EDIFACT, it is UNA or UNB. So in this case, if I know that my input file is always going to start with the name H, I can configure a rule saying that pick up this agreement. Apply the rule. So now if you see the input file, it starts with H followed by caret sign. So to be more specific, let me just specify H followed by the caret sign. And let me test the translation. So now if you see, this rule was applied with start segment ID. There are numerous other ways, including the concept of expression based or version based options, which can also be applied for source file identification rules. So once my source file identification rule is configured, my translator is all set to receive files of this particular format and start translating them. After translation, the output file is sent across to the required output location. So at the end of this whole demo, we have understood the concept of creation of agreements, the usage of workflow, simulating once the whole agreement is ready, configuring source file identification rules, and having your whole translation process tested both through the simulator productivity tool and implementer as well as the translation tool of the translator. Thank you.